learning from the COVID-19 pandemic in order to better prepare for the next crisis.
So Ken, you're bringing us an interesting article that talks about lessons learned from COVID-19 and how they apply to cybersecurity and crisis. Can you tell us a little more?
Yeah, sure, Matt. So it's kind of interesting that we're not even necessarily out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there are lessons we can take away in how different businesses and organizations initially responded to the pandemic, so that we can better prepare for future disasters that are either natural, pandemic related, or who knows what. So really more so, how do we better prepare for the unknowns of tomorrow? And this was an interesting article from Perimeter 81, and one of the first big areas they talk about is the climate crisis. And unlike the pandemic, which in 2019 wasn't necessarily listed by the World Economic Forum as being a top 10 likelihood of major disaster type things that an organization might want to prepare for, weather-related events kind of dominate the top 10 there. If you think of things like earthquakes, hurricanes, flooding, they're all things that can impact security one way or another, not necessarily through something like a network intrusion, but what happens if a site gets taken out? Well, your network isn't necessarily as reliable anymore, and are you now overloading and potentially leaving some kind of vulnerability in a way that maybe a DR situation has been laid out. So it's an interesting thought process to say, well, what did we learn or do well in how we responded initially or throughout the pandemic in order to better prepare for a situation such as, say, flooding or something to that effect. So if we look at what did we learn in this, obviously, almost immediately when the pandemic came about, it was kind of like flipping a switch almost, that all of a sudden a lot of the world started to go into lockdown mode. And people who would ordinarily come into an office every day were now working from home or perhaps working from a satellite location. And they still needed
many for the first time in their lives.
Yeah. I mean, we think about it, just how many people is that an accurate statement for, that they were used to going to an office every day for every job function they had to do. So now there was a lot of uncertainty when this all happened because, well, will they be able to still do their job from home? How do we protect their data? How do we protect their equipment from that the business owns? So how did we respond to that? And we is kind of a more broad term, not necessarily the three of us or even AT&T, but we, the broader environment of businesses and organizations. So if we look at a lot of the movement towards backing up data, whether it's cloud data backups or just having better disaster recovery scenarios set up so that if something does happen, there's at least a data record that you can fall back on. So if we think of the working from home scenario, if something happens to that piece of equipment or the data that was on it, it's at least backed up somewhere. It kind of falls in with a lot of things we've probably talked about before, of saying, well, make sure you back up your data early and often, or have a frequent backup done. Interestingly enough, we get into something that we may have seen quite a bit of around March of last year, was how much that bad actors will pivot to benefit from a situation. So if we think of all of the spam and phishing we may have gotten last year, warning of the crisis or hospitals closing or just lockdowns. That was just how much bad actors were looking to capitalize on the situation, that if I can capitalize on fear or anxiety, someone might be more likely to click this link or to fill out a form to give me their information.
Mm-hmm.
So it really also then begins to tell us, well, we should really have zero trust in identity and in those types of solutions from an organizational perspective, so that you can actually, if something happens and maybe credentials end up out there, how do you continue to validate that? You think of strong multi-factor authentication, strong passwords, passwords frequently expiring, and even just as basic as employee training. I'm sure we can all remember around this time last year, there was an increase in training, maybe not necessarily to everyone, but there was new training going out explaining how are we expected to communicate amongst a team that was previously all in an office together. Now they're all remote together. Will it be via SMS? What might or might not be asked via SMS or via email? And then, interestingly enough, kind of linking to your story, that infrastructure will continue to obviously be an item that will come up. And not necessarily just referring to like the pipeline story we talked about earlier, but just even all these people are remote, or we need to be monitoring things, just the growth of Internet of Things. And it's an area that isn't really regulated in the sense of endpoint solutions. How are we protecting those devices that might be out there? There's not necessarily a lot. It's a situation where someone says, "Oh, I was able to just plug it in, and now it works." But did it come with a default password, or did it force you to update a password? So just making sure, planning for, well, if we're deploying these types of items, how do we make them as secure or as protected as we can, at least? And that's, for the most part, that was a lot of what the article was talking about. It is really interesting just to see how we're already starting to see lessons learned from how organizations responded and were beginning to adapt to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and saying, well, how can we better respond to future instances or crises?
It sounds like a lot of the different ways of responding to crisis, at least from an IT standpoint, is having backups and having disaster recovery plans. Whether that means the building is burned down, it's full of water, or no one can go to the office. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting thought I hadn't actually considered. I mean, when you talk about disaster recovery, the way that I typically think about it, at least from my job responsibilities, is a hard drive has died. A server rack has suddenly caught fire. But real world emergencies have the same impact on IT, slightly different. But in terms of continuity of business, I guess, yeah, they have the same kind of effects.
Yep. Yeah, and even just how many maybe organizations didn't necessarily have a plan for that type of situation beforehand. So now it's almost kind of like growing up. We might have perhaps had a plan for, it's like a fire drill at school. If the fire alarm goes off, we drill it and make sure everyone knows what to do. Something similar to promote.
Sorry. Yeah, even places that do have disaster recovery plans on paper may never have exercised them. And then when you exercise a plan like that is when you find out what works and what doesn't. Sometimes you may realize that, oh, hey, I forgot a step where I was supposed to do this, and now my backup is no longer valid, or now I've locked myself out of a system because I did something out of order. Drilling, response is important to make sure the details are right.
Yeah, I would say that I think that it would play second fiddle because and it's interesting that it brings up the CIA, the triad, and disaster recovery. So, no one thinks about, natural disasters and what it would do to infrastructures and making sure that you have everything in place, whether you have a hot site, cold site, whatever it may be, warm site, to be able to bring things online. If one site goes down, you have, to keep your business in order. But yeah, it's interesting that cyber attacks has taken second, in a close second to actual climate change.